Damon Coleman was 41 years old and worked as an operations systems consultant in Austin, Texas. Most people believed Victoria Hayes had built Veyra Collective from the ground up. Damon looked forgettable, an old Ford Ranger store-brand coffee, and a worn sweater he had owned for years. What they didn't know was that the company's entire operational backbone existed because of him. At 2:13 a.m., he opened his laptop, entered his password, and felt his jaw tighten as the screen flashed "Access revoked." Before we continue, tell me what country you're watching from and what your local time is right now. And if you enjoy stories where patience beats arrogance, subscribe to the channel. And 2 years earlier, before investors, before press interviews, before the expensive office overlooking Congress Avenue in downtown Austin, Veyra Collective had existed as nothing more than an idea spoken across a kitchen table. The idea belonged to Victoria Hayes. The plan belonged to nobody. At the time, Victoria was working in corporate sales for a regional healthcare supplier. She was good with people, good with presentations, good at making a room pay attention. But she was frustrated. She complained constantly about burned-out office workers. Everywhere she looked, companies talked about employee wellness while doing almost nothing meaningful for their staff. One evening, at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in Round Rock, she spent nearly an hour explaining her idea to Damon Coleman. The narrator noticed something unusual about Damon that night. Most people listened to ideas and immediately talked about money. Damon listened for weaknesses. Victoria described customized wellness packages that employers could send to workers every month. She talked about stress relief products, healthy snacks, mental health resources, personalized care packages. The idea sounded promising. The execution sounded impossible. Victoria had no suppliers, no software, no fulfillment process, no inventory system, no logistics strategy, no pricing model, no customer acquisition plan. Most people would have nodded politely and changed the subject. Damon started asking questions. How many employees per company? How would inventory be tracked? Who would manage shipping? How would customer preferences be stored? How would recurring orders be processed? Victoria didn't have answers. What she had was enthusiasm. For some reason, that was enough to keep Damon interested. Over the next several weeks, they met repeatedly, usually at Victoria's apartment in North Austin, usually around her small kitchen table, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning. The table became headquarters for a company that did not yet exist. Sheets of paper covered every surface: supplier lists, cost estimates, flowcharts, customer journey maps, shipping calculations. Damon spent hours building spreadsheets while Victoria filled notebooks with ideas. The difference between them was obvious. Victoria thought in headlines. Damon thought in systems. Victoria imagined success. Damon imagined obstacles. Together, those differences appeared to complement each other, at least in the beginning. One night, Victoria pushed her laptop aside and leaned back in her chair. "Do you know why most businesses fail?" she asked. Damon looked up from a spreadsheet. "Cash flow." She laughed. "That too." He returned to his screen. "What do you think?" "Most businesses fail because people get excited about the destination and ignore the road." Victoria stared at him. Then she smiled. That smile would become familiar over the following years, not because it showed agreement, because it usually appeared whenever Damon solved a problem she had not considered. Within 3 months, Damon had created the first complete operating model: vendor sourcing, packaging workflows, customer onboarding, order fulfillment, shipping protocols, subscription billing, inventory forecasting. Most of it existed inside spreadsheets and diagrams, but it existed. For the first time, the idea had structure. Victoria was thrilled. She immediately began talking about investors. Damon immediately began talking about testing. Victoria wanted growth. Damon wanted proof. They compromised. In January, they launched a small pilot program under the name Bright Nest Wellness. The first customers came from Victoria's professional contacts. A local accounting firm ordered 20 employee wellness kits. Then a dental practice ordered 30. Then a marketing agency ordered 50. The orders were small. The margins were thin. But the process worked. That mattered more. The narrator observed that Damon rarely celebrated milestones. Every success simply revealed the next problem waiting to be solved. When the first orders arrived, he focused on fulfillment errors. When shipping improved, he focused on inventory tracking. When inventory stabilized, he focused on scaling. Meanwhile, Victoria focused on visibility. She created social media content. She attended networking events. She introduced herself as the founder of Brightnest Wellness. Nobody questioned it. After all, she was the person standing in front of the room. Damon preferred staying behind the scenes. Public attention made him uncomfortable. He skipped conferences whenever possible. He declined podcast invitations. He rarely appeared in promotional photos. That decision seemed harmless at the time. In reality, it was planting the seeds of a future problem. As Brightnest grew, new people entered the picture. Marketing consultants, design freelancers, potential investors, business coaches. Most of them met Victoria first. Many never met Damon at all. The company story slowly changed. Not because anyone explicitly lied, because people naturally assumed the visible person was the builder. Victoria never corrected them. At first, Damon barely noticed. He was too busy. Every day brought new operational challenges. A supplier in Dallas missed a shipment. A packaging vendor increased prices. A software integration failed. Customer preferences disappeared from the database. Problems arrived endlessly. Damon solved them one by one. Months passed. Revenue climbed steadily. The business expanded faster than expected. Victoria became more confident, more polished, more ambitious. The media attention began shortly afterward. A local Austin business blog featured Brightnest, then a startup newsletter, then a regional business podcast. Victoria handled every interview. Damon listened to one episode while driving home from a supplier meeting. The host asked how Brightnest had become successful so quickly. Victoria smiled. "You have to believe in your vision before anyone else does." The statement wasn't wrong, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The vision had started the company. The systems had kept it alive. Damon turned off the podcast before the interview ended. Not because he was angry, because something felt unfamiliar, something subtle, something difficult to name. That evening, he sat alone at his apartment and reviewed the latest growth projections. The numbers looked promising. The future looked bright. Yet for the first time, he noticed a gap forming between perception and reality. Outside the company, people increasingly saw Victoria as the creator. Inside the company, nearly every critical process still depended on Damon. Neither of them discussed the imbalance. Neither of them addressed it. They simply continued working. Late one Friday evening, after a long meeting with a potential investor, Victoria packed her laptop and headed toward the door. Then she stopped. She looked back at Damon. The office was nearly empty. Only the hum of fluorescent lights filled the room. Victoria smiled. "People buy confidence before they buy systems." Damon glanced up from his computer. The words sounded harmless, maybe even true, but as the office door closed behind her, the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. And for the first time, Damon began wondering what would happen if the person selling the story ever decided she no longer needed the person building it. Ominous for the rest of Damon's story. Growth rarely arrives with fanfare. For Brightnest Wellness, it arrived through spreadsheets. One order became 10. 10 became 50. 50 became hundreds, then thousands, and almost nobody outside the company understood how much of that growth depended on Damon Coleman. By the second year, Damon was living two separate lives. During the day, he worked as an independent operations consultant for manufacturing and logistics companies across Texas. He spent hours helping clients solve inventory problems, automate reporting systems, and streamline distribution networks. At night, he became the engine behind Brightnest. Most evenings ended the same way: a quick dinner, a 30-minute drive through Austin traffic, then another 6 or 7 hours behind a computer screen. The narrator observed that Damon rarely talked about sacrifice. He simply accepted it as part of building something valuable. While Victoria focused on growth opportunities, Damon focused on survival. Every new customer created another challenge. Every new challenge required another system. Every new system required another late night. One Monday morning, Brightnest received a corporate order from a technology company in Dallas. 300 employee wellness kits, the largest order in company history. Victoria celebrated immediately. She posted about it on LinkedIn. She scheduled a team lunch. She called it a breakthrough moment. Damon looked at the numbers and saw something else. 300 kits meant more inventory, more warehouse coordination, more shipping labels, more opportunities for mistakes. Instead of celebrating, he spent the next 14 hours rebuilding the fulfillment workflow. The order shipped on time, no mistakes, no missing items, no customer complaints. Victoria received congratulations. Damon received another problem to solve. And there was always another problem. The Shopify store began experiencing traffic spikes. Damon redesigned the back-end architecture. The subscription system started producing duplicate invoices. Damon fixed the billing logic. Inventory forecasting became unreliable. Damon built predictive spreadsheets using sales history and seasonal trends. Customer support tickets increased. Damon created automated routing systems. The company continued growing. Few people noticed who was holding it together. That pattern repeated everywhere. Victoria became increasingly visible. She appeared on business podcasts throughout Texas. She attended startup conferences in Dallas, Houston, and Austin. She spoke on panels discussing entrepreneurship and innovation. Photographers captured her standing beside company banners. Articles described her as a visionary founder. The attention seemed to energize her. The more visibility she received, the more she pursued it. Meanwhile, Damon stayed exactly where he had always been, behind a screen, inside spreadsheets, buried under operational details. He preferred it that way. At least he thought he did. One afternoon, Victoria invited him to join her at a startup networking event near Lady Bird Lake. He declined. "Not my thing," he said. Victoria laughed. "It should be your thing." Damon shook his head. "No thanks." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You're the smartest person in this company, Damon." He returned to his laptop. "That's debatable." "No." Her smile widened. "It's not." The comment sounded complimentary, yet something about it lingered. The narrator noticed a pattern beginning to emerge. Victoria increasingly spoke about Damon as a resource, not a partner, not an equal, a resource. The distinction was subtle, but important. Several months later, Brightnest reached another milestone. 5,000 active monthly subscriptions. Revenue exceeded projections. New investors began showing interest. For the first time, serious money entered the conversation. That was when Damon noticed the first crack. It arrived in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, an investor pitch deck, 32 slides, prepared for a meeting with an Austin venture capital group. Victoria emailed the presentation late on a Thursday night. Damon opened it after midnight. Most of the content looked familiar. Revenue charts, growth projections, customer retention metrics, market expansion strategies, operational forecasts. Nearly all of the underlying data had come from Damon. He moved through the slides one by one. Then he reached the company leadership section. His eyes stopped. Victoria Hayes, founder and CEO. A large professional photograph appeared beside her biography. Education, achievements, leadership background, media appearances. Then came the next slide. Company advisors. Several names appeared. Marketing consultants, industry experts, financial advisors. Damon's name appeared there. Near the bottom. Technical advisor. 3 words. That was all. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Not angry. Not shocked. Simply confused. Technical advisor. That wasn't what he had been. It wasn't what he was. He had built nearly every operational system inside the company. He had designed fulfillment processes, built forecasting models, negotiated suppliers, created inventory systems, structured subscription management, developed customer workflows. Technical advisor felt strangely small. The narrator noticed something important. Many people would have called immediately. Many would have demanded answers. Damon did neither. Instead, he saved a copy of the presentation. Then he continued working. The next morning, Victoria called. "Did you review the deck?" "I did." "What do you think?" "The numbers are solid." Victoria laughed. Only you would review 32 slides and comment on the numbers. Damon hesitated, then asked quietly, "Why am I listed as a technical advisor?" A brief pause followed. Not long, but noticeable. Victoria's voice remained casual. "It makes the structure easier for investors." "Easier how?" "They understand it better." Damon leaned back in his chair. "I see. We both know titles aren't important." The narrator noticed Damon studying the wall in front of him. His expression never changed. Maybe titles weren't important. Maybe they were. What mattered more was why the title had changed. Victoria quickly redirected the conversation toward upcoming meetings, new opportunities, future expansion, additional funding. Eventually, the discussion ended, but the question remained: why had the title changed? Over the next several weeks, Damon paid closer attention. Small details started appearing. During interviews, Victoria referred to Brightnest as my company. At conferences, she discussed my vision. In meetings, she often described operational systems without mentioning who built them. Individually, none of those moments seemed significant. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns were something Damon understood very well. Patterns revealed future outcomes. That was true in software. It was true in logistics. It was true in people. The growth continued. Revenue climbed. Customers expanded. Investors became increasingly interested. From the outside, Brightness looked stronger than ever. Inside, something was changing. One evening, after most employees had left for the day, Damon sat alone reviewing platform performance reports. The office was quiet. Only the sound of air conditioning filled the room. A notification appeared on his screen. An updated investor deck. Victoria had made several revisions. Damon opened the file. Most changes were minor, until he reached the leadership section. Again. Founder and CEO, Victoria Hayes, then advisors, then consultants, then partners. His name remained exactly where it had been before. Technical advisor, nothing else. No mention of operational architecture. No mention of company systems. No mention of infrastructure development. No mention of ownership discussions from the early days. Just 3 words: technical advisor. Damon stared at the screen, then quietly downloaded another copy. A small action. Simple. Unremarkable. But as he saved the file into a new folder labeled Corporate Records, a thought crossed his mind for the first time. Someone wasn't just rewriting a title. Someone might eventually try rewriting history. And if that happened, records would matter far more than memories. The first real warning did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as a document. Most betrayals did not begin with dramatic confrontations. They began with small edits, tiny adjustments. A word changed here. A title changed there. Things that seemed too insignificant to fight about. Things that became important later. 3 weeks after Damon discovered the investor deck listing him as a technical advisor, Brightnest began preparing for another funding round. The company had grown rapidly. Monthly revenue had crossed 6 figures. New corporate clients were signing contracts. The warehouse operation in North Austin was running close to capacity. Several investors wanted deeper access to company information. Victoria was thrilled. Damon was busy. That difference increasingly defined the company. Victoria focused on what was coming. Damon focused on what could break. One Tuesday morning, Damon received a notification from the company's shared document platform. Corporate Structure Update. The title sounded routine. He opened the document. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Ownership overview, leadership responsibilities, operational hierarchy, investor relations. Then his eyes stopped. The document listed Victoria Hayes. Founder and CEO Damon Coleman. Senior Technical Advisor Damon read the line twice, then a third time. Senior Technical Advisor, not co-founder, not operating partner, not head of systems architecture, not director of operations. A title that suggested expertise, but not ownership. A title that implied support, not creation. The narrator noticed Damon sitting motionless for several seconds. He wasn't angry. That was one of the most unusual things about him. Anger rarely controlled his decisions. Curiosity did. He opened previous versions of the document. Version history stretched back months. One revision after another. One small change after another. The pattern became visible. Co-founder, then founding operations partner, then operations advisor, then technical advisor, then senior technical advisor. Each adjustment seemed harmless by itself. Together, they told a different story. Someone had been reducing his role step by step, carefully, gradually, quietly. Damon downloaded every version, then saved them inside a folder labeled Historical Records. No complaints, no confrontation, just documentation. That evening, Victoria stopped by his office. She carried 2 coffees, a habit she used whenever she wanted a conversation to feel casual. She placed 1 cup on his desk. "You've been buried in spreadsheets all day." Damon nodded. "Forecasting inventory." Victoria sat down. "Exciting life. It pays the bills." She laughed. Then her expression shifted. Subtle, measured. "I saw you open the structure document." Damon looked up. "I did." "What did you think?" The narrator noticed how carefully Victoria phrased the question, not whether he noticed, whether he liked it. Damon remained calm. "I noticed my title changed. It's more investor-friendly." The same explanation. Again. Damon took a sip of coffee. "What part of being a co-founder isn't investor-friendly?" Victoria smiled. The smile appeared practiced. "People understand leadership structures better when they're streamlined." Damon studied her for a moment. The explanation sounded polished, prepared, almost rehearsed. "What exactly are we streamlining?" he asked. Victoria looked away briefly. "Nothing important." Nothing important. The phrase lingered after she left, because the more often people claimed something wasn't important, the more likely it was to matter. Over the following month, additional changes appeared. A company press release announced Brightnest's expansion. Victoria was featured prominently. Her photograph occupied half the page. The article described her entrepreneurial journey, her vision, her leadership, her strategy. Damon's name appeared once, near the bottom, as part of a list. No mention of the systems he built, no mention of operational design, no mention of infrastructure development. The omission itself wasn't surprising. What surprised Damon was how consistent the omissions had become. Every article, every interview, every investor document, every company biography, the same pattern, the same story. Victoria became larger. Damon became smaller. Then Brooke Sterling arrived, and everything accelerated. Brooke was one of Austin's most respected branding consultants. 42 years old, sharp, confident, known for transforming growing companies into polished national brands. Victoria hired her to oversee Brightnest's next stage of development. The rebranding project immediately consumed the company. New messaging, new marketing, new identity concepts, new visual designs, new public positioning. Meetings filled entire weeks. Brooke quickly established herself as the loudest voice in the room. She challenged assumptions, asked difficult questions, rejected weak ideas without hesitation. Victoria loved her. The 2 women worked together constantly. Damon participated only when operational information was required, which suited him perfectly, until one meeting changed everything. The conference room overlooked downtown Austin. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Around the table sat department leads, marketing contractors, designers, and Brooke. The discussion focused on leadership profiles for upcoming investor materials. Brooke stood near a large display screen. A draft organizational chart filled the monitor. Victoria occupied the top position. Several departments branched underneath. Brooke pointed toward Damon's name. Then she paused. "What exactly is your position here?" The question sounded simple, yet the room became strangely quiet. The narrator noticed several people glance toward Victoria. Others looked at Damon. The silence stretched. Not long, only a few seconds, but long enough. Brooke waited. She wasn't trying to be rude. She genuinely wanted clarification, because based on the materials she had received, Damon's role appeared vague. Technical advisor, operations consultant, systems support. Different documents used different language. No consistent description existed. Damon opened his mouth to answer. Before he could speak, Victoria interrupted. Damon helps manage our operational infrastructure. The wording felt deliberate. Helps manage. Not built, not created, not designed. Helps manage. A small difference. A massive difference. Brooke nodded, then continued the meeting. Nobody else seemed bothered. Nobody else appeared to notice. But Damon noticed, because details mattered, especially repeated details. The meeting ended 2 hours later. Employees filtered back to their desks. The office slowly returned to normal. Damon remained seated for a moment. The empty conference room felt colder than before. Outside rain continued falling across downtown Austin. His reflection stared back from the darkened window. The narrator observed something changing inside him. Not anger, not resentment, recognition. Recognition that the story being told publicly no longer matched reality. For 2 years he had assumed the imbalance would correct itself, that eventually facts would matter, that eventually contributions would be acknowledged. Now he wasn't so sure. That evening he stayed late, long after most employees left, long after the office lights dimmed. He opened folders, downloaded records, archived communications, saved presentation drafts, stored organizational documents, preserved meeting notes. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, nothing confrontational, simply records, evidence, history, truth frozen in digital form. At nearly 10 o'clock, he opened one final folder. Inside sat dozens of files from Brightnest's earliest days. Spreadsheets created at Victoria's kitchen table, vendor negotiations, operational blueprints, forecasting models, the foundation of the entire company. Damon stared at the files quietly, then created a new backup, just in case, because for the first time he could see where this road might lead. And if someone was rewriting his role in the present, there was a good chance they would eventually try rewriting the past. As he shut down his computer and prepared to leave, a notification appeared on his phone. A calendar invitation. Subject: Executive Rebranding Strategy Meeting. Organizer: Victoria Hayes. Attendees: Victoria Hayes, Brooke Sterling, several department heads, Damon Coleman. He opened the meeting details. One line near the bottom caught his attention immediately. Discussion topic: leadership positioning during corporate transition. Damon read the sentence twice, then slipped the phone into his pocket. Outside, thunder rolled over Austin, and for the first time he began wondering whether the transition being discussed involved more than a company brand. The rebranding project officially began on a Monday morning. By Friday afternoon, Brightnest Wellness was already disappearing. Not physically, not operationally. The warehouse still shipped orders. The customer support team still answered emails. The subscription platform still processed payments. Everything worked exactly as before. But the story surrounding the company was changing. And stories Damon Coleman had learned often became more powerful than facts. The executive rebranding meeting took place in a glass conference room overlooking downtown Austin. Brooke Sterling stood at the front. Victoria sat beside her. Several department heads filled the remaining seats. A large presentation screen displayed a single phrase: the future of the brand. Brooke clicked to the next slide. A new logo appeared, then a new color palette, then a new website design. Everything looked polished, modern, expensive, designed to attract investors. The narrator noticed Damon paying attention not to what was being shown, but to what was missing. There was no mention of Brightnest's history, no mention of the company's founding, no mention of its development, no mention of the people who built it. Only the future. Brooke continued. The wellness market has become crowded. To scale nationally, we need a stronger identity. Several executives nodded. Victoria smiled. Brooke clicked again. The next slide appeared. Veyra Collective. The new company name. Simple, elegant, investor-friendly. The room reacted positively. Compliments filled the air. Victoria looked pleased. Damon remained quiet. The name itself wasn't the problem. Companies rebranded all the time. The details surrounding the rebrand concerned him more. For the next several weeks, the transformation accelerated. New logos appeared. New social media accounts launched. Marketing materials were redesigned. Email signatures changed. Company signage was replaced. The narrator observed that most employees viewed the changes as exciting. Fresh energy, new opportunities, a sign of growth. Nobody questioned the process. Few people ever do when success appears to be increasing. One afternoon, Damon opened the preview version of the new corporate website. He scrolled slowly. The homepage looked impressive. Professional photography, modern design, strong messaging. Everything appeared carefully crafted. Then he reached the company's story section and stopped. The page described Victoria Hayes as the visionary founder who transformed an idea into one of Texas's fastest-growing wellness companies. Several paragraphs followed: her background, her leadership philosophy, her entrepreneurial journey. Damon continued scrolling. His name never appeared, not once. The narrator noticed something unusual. Damon didn't react immediately. He simply reread the page, then read it again, carefully, objectively, searching for any mention of the operational side of the company, any acknowledgement of the systems, the infrastructure, the architecture, the supply network, the fulfillment design. Nothing. The company history had been rewritten, not partially, completely. The story now suggested that Veyra Collective had emerged almost entirely through Victoria's leadership, as though the business had assembled itself, as though no one else had played a meaningful role. Damon downloaded a copy of the page, saved screenshots, archived source files, then returned to work, because documentation had become a habit, a necessary one. A week later, another development caught his attention. The company hired several outside consultants to assist with transition planning. Among them was a corporate restructuring specialist. His presence seemed unusual. Veyra wasn't merging. It wasn't being acquired. Why hire restructuring experts? The question lingered. A few days later, Damon found part of the answer. The discovery happened accidentally. He was reviewing user permissions inside one of the company's internal platforms, something he did routinely. Most employees ignored administrative settings. Damon paid attention to them. That afternoon, he noticed a new account. Transition owner. The username immediately stood out. The account possessed elevated privileges, broad access, administrative authority, far more access than a normal employee required. Damon opened the profile. Most identifying information had been hidden. No department listed, no employee profile, no internal contact information, just permissions, powerful permissions. The narrator observed Damon's expression remain unchanged, but internally something shifted. Because hidden administrative accounts rarely appeared by accident, someone had created it deliberately. Someone wanted control, and someone didn't want attention. Damon exported the access logs, saved screenshots, archived timestamps, then continued investigating. The results were troubling. The account had been created nearly 3 months earlier, long before the official rebranding announcement, long before employees learned about Veyra Collective, long before the transition meetings, which meant planning had begun much earlier than anyone realized, much earlier than Damon realized. That evening, he drove home through Austin traffic while replaying events in his mind. The title changes, the rewritten company history, the investor presentations, the new administrative accounts. Individually, each event could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns mattered. At home, Damon opened one of his evidence folders. What had started as a few saved files now contained hundreds: emails, documents, meeting notes, version histories, ownership discussions, investor materials, permission logs, screenshots. The collection grew larger every week. He wasn't building a case, not yet. He was preserving reality. There was a difference, a reality that increasingly seemed vulnerable. The next major warning arrived 2 weeks later. Victoria announced a leadership retreat, senior personnel only. The event took place at a luxury resort outside Lake Travis. 2 days of planning sessions, strategic discussions, executive workshops. Damon attended reluctantly. Most of the event focused on growth initiatives, national expansion, partnership opportunities, investor relations, Nothing unusual. Until the second afternoon. Brooke presented a session titled Building Founder-Led Brand Authority. The phrase immediately caught Damon's attention. The presentation focused heavily on Victoria, her visibility, her public image, her leadership story, her influence. Slide after slide reinforced the same message. The company and Victoria were becoming inseparable. Brand and founder, founder and brand. One identity, one story, one face. The narrator noticed something important. Every successful company had contributors, operations leaders, technical experts, financial strategists, product developers. Yet this presentation increasingly erased everyone except Victoria. Even Brooke seemed surprised by the extent of it. At one point, she asked a simple question. Should we include founding team narratives? The room became briefly quiet. Victoria answered quickly. I think simplicity is stronger. Simplicity, another harmless word, another dangerous one, because simplicity often required removing inconvenient details, like co-founders, like operational architects, like people whose existence complicated a preferred story. That evening, Damon stood alone on the resort balcony overlooking Lake Travis. The sun disappeared behind the water. Boats drifted across the distance. Everything looked peaceful. Yet the narrator could see what Damon increasingly understood. The rebranding wasn't just cosmetic. It wasn't just a new logo, or a new website, or a new company name. It was a transfer of credit, a transfer of history, and perhaps something even larger. When he returned to Austin the following morning, he opened several internal systems. Then, one by one, he reviewed administrative permissions, ownership structures, account privileges, access hierarchies. Everything appeared normal. Mostly. Except for one detail. The transition owner account had gained even more authority. Several permissions previously assigned to Damon now belonged to it. Not many. Just enough to matter. Just enough to notice. Someone was preparing for something. Slowly, carefully, methodically, the same way Damon would have done it. That realization disturbed him more than anything else, because it suggested intelligence, planning, patience, the qualities most dangerous when combined with ambition. Late that evening, he sat alone in the office reviewing access logs. Outside downtown, Austin glowed beneath the city lights. The office floor had emptied hours earlier. Only silence remained. Then another notification appeared. A permission update. Routine on the surface. But one line immediately caught his eye. Future administrative ownership transition. Scheduled. Pending approval. Effective date not listed. Damon stared at the screen, then quietly saved another copy, because for the first time he no longer wondered whether someone was preparing to replace him. Now he knew. The only question left was when. The removal happened on a Wednesday, not during a board meeting, not after a legal dispute, not following a dramatic confrontation. It happened while Damon Coleman was asleep. That detail stayed with him later, because after everything he had done for the company, after every late night, every system he built, every crisis he solved, nobody even had the courage to do it face to face. The first alert arrived at 2:07 a.m. Damon never heard it. His phone rested on the nightstand beside his bed. A second alert arrived 30 seconds later, then another, then another. By 2:13 a.m., 7 separate notifications had accumulated. Password changed. Administrative permissions modified. Security credentials updated. Account ownership revised. The narrator observed that Damon normally slept lightly. That night, exhaustion finally caught up with him. He had spent 14 consecutive hours solving fulfillment problems tied to a new corporate contract. For once, he slept through everything. At 5:41 a.m., his alarm sounded. The routine began exactly as it always did. Coffee, shower, news headlines, then a glance toward his phone. The notifications immediately caught his attention. His stomach tightened, not from panic, from recognition. He already knew what he was looking at. Years spent managing systems taught him how to read warning signs, and these warnings were not subtle. Damon sat at the kitchen counter and opened the first alert. Administrative permissions modified. The second. User privileges updated. The third, ownership access reassigned. The fourth, multi-factor authentication reset. The fifth, recovery credentials changed, one by one. Methodical, deliberate, professional. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. He opened his laptop, entered his credentials, pressed enter. The system paused, then returned a message. Access denied. He tried again. Same result. He opened a second platform. Denied. A third. Denied. A fourth. Denied. Every critical system connected to Veyra Collective had been locked. The narrator noticed Damon sitting perfectly still. Many people would have cursed, shouted, thrown something across the room. Damon simply stared at the screen, because rage would not change the facts. The facts mattered, and the facts were becoming increasingly clear. Someone had executed a coordinated removal, a planned removal, not a mistake, not an accident, not a technical issue, a decision. At 6:12 a.m., his phone vibrated. A text message appeared. Victoria Hayes. The message contained only one sentence. We're moving in a different direction. No explanation. No phone call. No meeting request. No acknowledgement of 2 years spent building the company. Just 11 words. Damon reread the text twice, then set the phone down. The silence inside the apartment felt heavier than usual. Outside, Austin traffic slowly awakened. Inside, something ended. Yet the narrator noticed something unusual. Damon still didn't panic. Instead, he opened a notebook. Physical paper. Something he used whenever problems became important. He wrote down the time, the alerts, the message, the sequence. Then he began documenting everything, because evidence started with details. At 7:30 a.m., he drove toward headquarters. The Veyra office occupied part of a modern building near downtown Austin, a location Damon had personally helped select 18 months earlier. He remembered touring properties with Victoria, comparing lease terms, reviewing square footage, calculating growth projections. Now he was driving toward a building that no longer seemed to belong to him. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 35. The sky hung gray above the city. By the time he arrived, employees were beginning to enter the building. Several recognized him immediately. Most looked away. The narrator noticed that reaction. Avoidance. People often avoided eye contact when they knew something uncomfortable. Damon walked toward the entrance, removed his access card, pressed it against the scanner. Red light. Access denied. He waited. Tried again. Red light. Again. Nothing. The door remained locked. A receptionist inside noticed him. For a moment she appeared uncomfortable. Then she picked up a phone. A minute later, the building's operations manager approached. His name was Steve. Damon had known him for over a year. They had spoken dozens of times. Steve looked exhausted. "Damon?" "Morning." Steve hesitated, then glanced toward the lobby. "I'm sorry." The words arrived quietly, not rehearsed, not corporate, genuine, which somehow made them worse. Damon nodded. "My access was removed." Steve exhaled slowly. "Last night." "Who authorized it?" Steve looked away. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both men already knew. Damon remained calm. "I need to collect some personal items." Steve shifted uneasily. "I was instructed not to allow access." The narrator observed something subtle. Steve wasn't being hostile. He was embarrassed, caught between policy and conscience. Damon understood. The man wasn't the problem. The problem sat several floors above them. He thanked Steve and stepped aside. The conversation ended. No argument, no scene, no raised voices. Just another fact added to the growing list. At 8:21 a.m., Damon sent a brief email from his personal account, requesting a formal explanation. No response. At 8:44 a.m., he sent another requesting confirmation of his employment status. No response. At 9:15 a.m., he called Victoria. Voicemail. At 9:17 a.m., he called again. Voicemail. At 9:23 a.m., he received a response, not a call, an email, short, clinical, prepared by someone who had likely revised it several times before sending. The message stated that Veyra Collective had completed a leadership restructuring process. Operational responsibilities would be reassigned. Future communication should occur through company representatives. No mention of ownership. No mention of contributions. No mention of history. Only restructuring. Damon read the email once, then archived it, because even lies could become evidence. The remainder of the morning brought additional discoveries. His company credit card stopped functioning. Vendor permissions disappeared. Internal communication channels became inaccessible. Several shared accounts changed ownership. The transition wasn't occurring. It had already occurred. The decision had been made long before he learned about it. By noon, Damon sat inside a small coffee shop several blocks from headquarters. A notebook rested open in front of him. Beside it sat his laptop. The same laptop that contained much of the company's original history, the original pricing models, the first operational plans, early vendor contracts, system architecture records, founding correspondence, years of work. The narrator noticed him reviewing dates, comparing timelines, connecting events, the hidden administrative account, the title changes, the rewritten website, the leadership transition meetings, the rebranding. Every piece suddenly aligned. This had not been a spontaneous decision. It had been preparation, months of preparation, months during which Victoria smiled in meetings while building a plan to remove him. The realization should have triggered anger. Instead, it triggered clarity. Clarity often arrived after denial disappeared. At 2:47 p.m., another email reached his inbox, this one from a vendor he had worked with since Brightnest's earliest days. The supplier was asking why a new executive had replaced Damon as the primary contact. The vendor seemed confused. Damon simply replied, "I am no longer authorized to represent Veyra Collective." Nothing more. Nothing less. Facts. Only facts. By evening, Austin's skyline glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Damon remained seated inside the coffee shop. Most customers had already left. The day felt impossibly long. Yet he knew something important. Victoria believed the difficult part was over. She believed removing him solved the problem. She believed access created ownership. Control created history. Authority created truth. But systems worked differently. And Damon understood systems better than anyone. As darkness settled across the city, he closed his notebook. Inside were pages of timestamps, messages, alerts, records, facts, the first layer of evidence. Then he looked one final time toward the illuminated office tower in the distance, the office he helped build, the company he helped create, the future someone else believed they had stolen. And for the first time since receiving that text message, Damon asked himself a different question. Not how they removed him, but how much proof they had accidentally left behind while doing it. The next morning, Damon Coleman did something Victoria probably never expected. He stayed home. He did not post on social media. He did not publish accusations. He did not call investors. He did not send angry messages to employees. He did not drive back to the office demanding answers. He made coffee, opened his laptop, and started organizing evidence. The narrator observed that many people mistake silence for weakness. They assume a quiet person has accepted defeat. Sometimes silence means surrender. Sometimes it means preparation. Damon understood the difference. The apartment was unusually quiet. Sunlight filtered through the living room window. Outside, Austin continued moving forward as if nothing had happened. Traffic flowed, coffee shops filled, construction crews worked downtown. Inside the apartment, Damon began building a timeline. Not from memory, from records. Memory could be challenged. Records could not. He created folders. One folder for financial contributions, one for operational development, one for ownership discussions, one for company formation documents, one for investor communications, one for system architecture records, one for vendor contracts. The collection quickly expanded, because Damon had saved almost everything, not intentionally, not because he anticipated betrayal. Documentation was simply part of how his mind worked. Every important project generated records. Every decision left a trail. Every trail led somewhere. By noon, his dining table had disappeared beneath stacks of documents and open folders, email chains, invoices, contracts, meeting notes, spreadsheets, version histories. The company's entire evolution existed across thousands of files. The narrator noticed Damon pausing occasionally, not because he was overwhelmed, because certain documents triggered memories. The first supplier agreement, the original inventory forecast, the earliest subscription model, evidence of work, evidence of effort, evidence of creation, things Victoria now seemed eager to erase. Around 1 o'clock, Damon reached for his phone. There was one person he wanted to call before anyone else, Raymond Carter. The phone rang twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Well, that's a name I haven't seen in a while." Raymond Carter had retired 3 years earlier. Before retirement, he spent 4 decades practicing corporate law throughout Texas. He was 67 now, white-haired, sharp-eyed, blunt, the kind of attorney who spoke less than most people expected. Damon respected him because he preferred facts over theatrics. They met years earlier during a consulting project. The friendship survived long after the project ended. "You busy?" Damon asked. Raymond laughed. "I'm retired. I'm always busy." Damon smiled slightly, then explained what happened. The removal, the access revocations, the restructuring email, the title changes, the rebranding, the hidden transition account. Raymond listened without interruption. That alone told Damon the situation was serious. Most people interrupted. Raymond collected information. Several minutes passed, then silence. Finally, Raymond spoke. "Do you have records?" Damon looked around the apartment. The answer sat everywhere. "Yes." "How much?" "A lot." "Define a lot." Damon glanced toward the evidence folders. "Years." Another pause followed. Then Raymond exhaled slowly. "Good." Only one word, but Damon immediately understood its meaning. The narrator noticed something important. Raymond didn't ask whether Damon felt betrayed. He didn't ask whether Damon was angry. He didn't ask whether Victoria had acted unfairly. None of those questions mattered. Only evidence mattered. "Listen carefully," Raymond said. Damon leaned back in his chair. "Don't threaten her." "I wasn't planning to." "Don't post online." "I won't." "Don't contact employees." "Okay." "Don't give speeches." Damon almost laughed. "I don't give speeches." Raymond ignored the comment. Good records beat loud arguments every time. The sentence hung in the air. Simple, direct, true. Damon wrote it down. Then Raymond asked a different question. "Do you have an attorney?" "No." "You do now." The next morning, Raymond arranged an introduction. Abigail Foster, Houston-based, corporate litigation, business ownership disputes, intellectual property, partnership conflicts, the exact type of attorney Damon needed. Their first meeting took place over a video call. Abigail appeared precisely on time, professional, focused, direct, no unnecessary conversation, no small talk. The narrator immediately noticed similarities between Abigail and Damon. Both valued precision. Both preferred substance. Within minutes, Damon began sharing documents. Hours passed, email after email, folder after folder, contract after contract. Abigail reviewed everything carefully. Occasionally, she asked questions. Never emotional ones, always factual. "Who paid this invoice?" "I did." "Personal account?" "Yes." "Do you have records?" "Yes." "Good." Another document. Another question. "Who built this system?" "I did." "Can you prove it?" "Version history." "Excellent." More files, more records, more evidence. By late afternoon, Abigail had reviewed hundreds of pages. The apartment had grown quiet again. Only keyboard clicks and occasional conversation filled the space. Eventually, she removed her glasses and leaned back. The narrator noticed the change immediately. Something had shifted. She wasn't evaluating anymore. She was reaching conclusions. Damon waited. Abigail studied her notes, then spoke. "Tell me something." "Okay." "Why didn't you protect yourself sooner?" The question surprised him, not because it was unfair, because it was accurate. Damon thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "I trusted her." Abigail nodded slowly, as though she had heard the same answer many times before, because she probably had. Business disputes rarely began with enemies. They began with trust. The most expensive mistakes often did. She returned to her notes. More silence, more review. Finally, she looked directly into the camera. The words that followed stopped Damon completely. "Victoria's biggest mistake wasn't removing you." Damon frowned. "What was—" Abigail tapped several documents. "She seems to think she removed a contractor." The narrator noticed Damon waiting. Abigail continued, "These records tell a different story." She opened a timeline. The screen filled with dates, milestones, documents, contributions, payments, operational development, system ownership, vendor negotiations, corporate planning. Everything connected. Every major breakthrough traced back to Damon. Every major operational system originated with Damon. Every major infrastructure decision involved Damon. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Abigail folded her hands, then delivered the conclusion. "She didn't steal an idea." Silence. The words landed heavily. Then came the second sentence. "She stole an operating company." The room felt different afterward, more focused, more dangerous, because until that moment Damon had still viewed the situation emotionally. Betrayal, trust, friendship, partnership. Abigail viewed it differently. Ownership, contribution, control, evidence, law. The narrator observed something changing inside Damon. Not anger, clarity. The kind of clarity that appears when a problem finally receives a name. For days he had been trying to understand what happened. Now he understood. This wasn't about access. It wasn't about titles. It wasn't even about recognition. It was about possession. Someone had attempted to take control of a business while removing one of the people who built it. And unlike public opinion, courts cared about records. Records were exactly what Damon had. Before ending the meeting, Abigail outlined the next steps. Evidence preservation, ownership analysis, financial review, corporate structure investigation, vendor correspondence, historical communications. Everything would be examined. Everything would be documented. Everything would be verified. No shortcuts. No dramatic moves. No emotional reactions. Just facts. The call ended shortly before sunset. For several minutes, Damon remained seated alone at the dining table. The city outside slowly darkened. Traffic lights flickered in the distance. The evidence folders remained spread across the table. The same records, the same documents, the same facts. Yet they felt different now, because someone with experience had finally confirmed what they meant. Damon wasn't looking at memories. He was looking at leverage. And for the first time since Victoria's text message arrived, he realized something important. She believed she had already won. That belief might become the most expensive mistake she ever made. The following 2 weeks became a lesson in patience, not the passive kind, not the kind that waits and hopes, the disciplined kind, the kind that gathers facts while everyone else assumes the story is already finished. Every morning, Damon Coleman sat at the same dining table, coffee on the left, laptop in front of him, evidence folders spread across the surface. Every day, Abigail Foster added another piece to the timeline. Every day, the picture became clearer, and every day, the risks facing Victoria Hayes grew larger. The narrator observed that business disputes often look complicated from the outside. Inside, they usually come down to something much simpler. Who created value? Who can prove it? Abigail cared about proof, nothing else. 3 days after their first meeting, she requested complete financial records. Damon provided everything he still possessed: bank statements, receipts, wire confirmations, expense reports, vendor payments. The documentation stretched back more than 2 years. One transaction immediately attracted Abigail's attention, then another, then another. Soon she had highlighted dozens. Most people assumed Brightnest had launched with investor capital. The records showed something different. During the company's first 6 months, many expenses had been paid directly by Damon. Software subscriptions, domain registrations, inventory deposits, warehouse equipment, shipping software, vendor retainers, several emergency purchases, thousands of dollars, not company money, his money. The narrator noticed Damon looking slightly uncomfortable when Abigail pointed it out. He never viewed those payments as investments. At the time, they felt necessary. The company needed something. He paid for it. The company moved forward. Simple. But legally, those transactions mattered a great deal, especially because they were documented. Abigail highlighted every payment, added dates, cross-referenced invoices, linked each expense to company operations. The timeline grew stronger. Then she moved to the technical records. This section proved even more valuable. Damon had built nearly every operational system used by Brightnest. Fortunately, software kept excellent records, version histories, creation dates, modification logs, user activity, repository commits, thousands of digital fingerprints. The narrator observed Abigail's expression becoming increasingly focused as she reviewed them. Every major system pointed back to Damon: inventory management, subscription architecture, vendor integrations, customer databases, fulfillment automation, forecasting tools. The evidence wasn't vague. It wasn't subjective. It was measurable. And dates do not lie. One afternoon, Abigail shared her screen during a video meeting. A timeline stretched across multiple years. Colored markers identified major milestones, every marker connected to supporting evidence. The visual impact surprised even Damon. When viewed individually, the document seemed ordinary. Together, they told an unmistakable story, a story that looked very different from Victoria's public narrative. Abigail pointed at one section. Here. Damon leaned closer. The first inventory forecasting system. She clicked. A design document appeared, created 18 months earlier. Author Damon Coleman. Another click. Supplier integration architecture. Author Damon Coleman. Another, subscription workflow. Author Damon Coleman. Again, vendor onboarding system. Author Damon Coleman. Again, corporate fulfillment design. Author Damon Coleman. The list continued. The narrator noticed Damon staring silently at the screen, not because he was surprised, because seeing years of work condensed into evidence felt strangely different, more permanent, more objective, less emotional. The facts existed regardless of anyone's opinion. That realization mattered. Meanwhile, Veyra Collective continued operating as though nothing had happened. Victoria appeared on podcasts, posted on LinkedIn, celebrated growth milestones, announced expansion plans. Publicly, the company looked stronger than ever. Privately, Abigail was building something far more dangerous, a record. The legal team began contacting third parties, suppliers, former contractors, technology vendors, service providers. The responses arrived steadily. Many proved useful. Some proved extraordinary. One supplier from Dallas forwarded an email chain from Brightnest's earliest months. The messages discussed inventory strategy, vendor relationships, shipping structures. Every operational decision involved Damon. Victoria participated occasionally, but Damon drove nearly every technical discussion. Another vendor supplied contract drafts. Same pattern. Another provided onboarding records. Same pattern. The evidence continued accumulating. The narrator observed a subtle change in Damon's mindset during this period. The feeling of personal betrayal gradually gave way to professional focus. That didn't mean the hurt disappeared. It remained. But emotion no longer directed his actions. Facts did. One evening, Abigail called unexpectedly. "Damon? What's up? I think we're ready." The words immediately captured his attention. "Ready for what?" "The first move." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Calculated silence. The kind that appears before something important. Abigail continued. "We're sending preservation notices." Damon understood immediately. The notices would formally instruct relevant parties to preserve records. Emails, documents, communications, system logs, financial records, anything potentially related to ownership and operational contributions. Destroying evidence afterward could create serious consequences. The narrator noticed Damon nodding slowly. This wasn't revenge. This was procedure, and procedure often mattered more than confrontation. For the next several days, Abigail's team finalized the documents. Every statement supported, every claim documented, every timeline verified. Nothing exaggerated, nothing speculative. The strength came from accuracy. Then attention shifted toward a larger target. The investor group preparing to evaluate Veyra's upcoming funding round. Richard Nolan led the group. Experienced, cautious, known for thorough due diligence. Exactly the type of investor who dislikes surprises. Victoria was scheduled to meet them during an important fundraising dinner at the Driscoll Hotel in downtown Austin. The meeting represented months of work, potentially millions of dollars, future expansion, national growth, everything she wanted. Abigail knew the timing, which made timing important. The narrator observed something interesting. Many people imagine legal strategy as dramatic courtroom battles. Often the most effective move happens long before court. Sometimes it arrives as a document. Sometimes it arrives as a question. Sometimes it arrives at exactly the wrong moment for the other side. 3 days before the investor dinner, Abigail completed the final package: ownership concerns, operational contribution evidence, preservation requests, supporting documentation, professional, measured, carefully written. Damon reviewed the material once. No anger, no accusations, only facts. When he finished reading, he closed the folder. For a moment, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Outside rain moved across Austin. The city lights reflected off wet pavement. Inside, years of effort had been transformed into evidence. The narrator noticed Damon thinking about Victoria, not with hatred, not even with bitterness, mostly with disbelief, because the entire situation had been unnecessary. Recognition would have cost nothing. Honesty would have cost nothing. Partnership would have preserved everything. Instead, she chose removal. She chose ownership by exclusion. She chose a story that required rewriting history. Now history was fighting back. The following morning, Abigail called again. "The notices go out this afternoon." Damon nodded. "Okay." Once they're received, everything changes. He understood. Up to this point, Victoria likely believed she controlled the narrative. After today, she would realize someone else possessed records she could not easily explain away, records that existed long before the rebranding, long before the title changes, long before the midnight removal. Abigail paused briefly, then added one final detail. "The investor dinner is in 48 hours. Damon looked out the window. Rain continued falling across the city. "That's unfortunate timing." Abigail almost smiled. "No." She closed the folder on her desk. "I think it's perfect timing." Late that afternoon, the notices were delivered. To Veyra Collective, to legal representatives, to relevant parties connected to the dispute. Professional, formal, unavoidable. Somewhere in Austin, Victoria Hayes was likely opening those documents, reading those pages, seeing years of evidence summarized into a timeline, realizing that Damon had not disappeared quietly. The narrator could almost picture the moment, because for the first time since she removed him, Victoria was no longer controlling the sequence of events, and 48 hours later she would walk into the most important investor dinner of her career, carrying a problem she could no longer hide. The Driscoll Hotel had witnessed more than a century of Texas history. Oil deals, political campaigns, corporate mergers, million-dollar negotiations. On that Thursday evening, it was about to witness something else, a story beginning to unravel. The ballroom, reserved by Veyra Collective, occupied one of the hotel's private event spaces. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead. Polished wood gleamed beneath warm lighting. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying drinks and appetizers. Everything had been carefully planned. Victoria Hayes wanted perfection. The evening represented one of the biggest opportunities of her career. Richard Nolan and several investment partners were attending. If everything went well, Veyra could secure enough funding to expand nationally. New warehouses, additional staff, new markets, the future Victoria had been chasing for years. The narrator observed that successful presentations often depend on confidence. Victoria possessed confidence in abundance. She entered the ballroom wearing a tailored navy suit and a smile perfected through hundreds of networking events. The room responded exactly as expected. Handshakes, introductions, compliments, interest, momentum. From the outside, everything appeared flawless. Several miles away, Damon Coleman sat inside his apartment. No hotel, no investors, no speeches. Just a laptop on the dining table, a cup of coffee beside it, and a quiet evening. The contrast felt appropriate. Victoria occupied the spotlight. Damon occupied the background. The same arrangement that had existed for years. The difference now was that someone else had begun asking questions. At exactly 6:18 p.m., Richard Nolan received a document package from Abigail Foster's office. Professional, detailed, supported by records. Nothing sensational, nothing inflammatory, simply information. The timing was not accidental. The narrator noticed something important. Abigail never intended to sabotage the meeting. She intended to ensure investors possessed all relevant facts before making decisions. There was a difference, a significant one. Inside the ballroom, dinner service had just begun. Victoria stood near a projection screen discussing growth forecasts. Revenue curves climbed upward. Customer acquisition numbers looked impressive. Expansion opportunities appeared substantial. Investors listened carefully. Then phones began vibrating. One by one, subtle at first, almost invisible. Richard Nolan glanced down at his screen. Another investor did the same. Then another. Victoria continued speaking, unaware, at least initially. Eventually she noticed. The rhythm of the room had changed. Attention drifted. Questions began forming. The presentation ended. Dinner continued. Conversation started. Then the first question arrived. Richard Nolan leaned forward. "Victoria, I'd like clarification on something." The room became quieter. Victoria smiled confidently. "Of course." Richard opened a folder on his tablet. "Who owns the operational architecture supporting Veyra?" The question surprised several people. Victoria barely hesitated. "The company does." Richard nodded slowly. "Can you elaborate?" Victoria maintained her smile. "Our systems were developed internally." The answer sounded polished, but not complete. Richard continued. "The documents we received suggest a different history." The narrator observed something flash briefly across Victoria's expression. Not panic, not yet. Recognition. She knew exactly which documents he meant. The preservation notices had arrived 2 days earlier. Now they were creating consequences. Victoria adjusted slightly in her chair. "What documents are you referring to?" Richard tapped the screen. "A timeline regarding Damon Coleman." The name immediately changed the atmosphere. Several investors exchanged glances. Others opened their own copies. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. The kind of shift experienced professionals notice immediately. Victoria's smile became tighter. "Damon was a contractor." Richard looked down again. "That's not how these records read." Silence. Short. Noticeable. Victoria folded her hands. "Damon assisted with operational development." Again. Assisted, helped, supported. The same language, the same strategy, the same attempt to minimize. The narrator noticed the investors studying their documents rather than listening. A dangerous sign. When investors stop accepting narratives and start reading records, control begins slipping away. Richard turned another page. According to these materials, Damon created the fulfillment architecture. Victoria answered carefully. He contributed. Another page. The inventory forecasting system. He worked on portions of it. Another page. The supplier integration network. He supported implementation. The questions continued, each one narrowing the gap between public narrative and documented history, each answer sounding increasingly incomplete. Across town, Damon remained unaware of the specific conversation. He wasn't monitoring the dinner. He wasn't calling investors. He wasn't participating, because Abigail advised against it. The evidence needed room to speak for itself, and evidence often spoke more effectively without interruption. Around 7:30 p.m., Damon received a brief update from Abigail. One sentence: "Questions have started." Nothing more, nothing less. He read the message, set down the phone, returned to reviewing records. The narrator observed something unusual. Damon genuinely felt no desire to celebrate. The situation brought relief, not satisfaction. There was a difference, because despite everything, part of him still remembered the company that existed before the conflict. The kitchen table, the early planning sessions, the first customers, the original dream. Watching that dream become a legal dispute carried its own sadness. Meanwhile, inside the Driscoll, the pressure continued increasing. Investors were no longer discussing expansion. They were discussing ownership, the most dangerous conversation possible during a funding process. Richard eventually asked the question everyone had begun wondering. If Damon wasn't a co-founder, why do his records appear connected to nearly every operational milestone? No immediate answer followed. Victoria looked towards several members of her team. Nobody spoke, because nobody possessed a good answer. The records existed, the timestamps existed, the invoices existed, the emails existed. Facts are difficult to argue with when they arrive organized. The narrator noticed another investor studying a printed timeline. His finger moved slowly down the page. Creation dates, financial contributions, system development, vendor relationships, operational leadership. The evidence formed a pattern. Patterns matter, especially to people deciding where millions of dollars should go. At approximately 8:15 p.m., another complication arrived. Several investors received a supplemental package from Abigail's office. Not accusations, supporting documentation, email excerpts, contract summaries, ownership concerns. Again, everything remained professional. Everything remained factual. No exaggeration, no emotional language. The strategy was effective precisely because it avoided drama. Richard spent several minutes reviewing the materials, then closed the folder. When he looked back at Victoria, the atmosphere had changed completely. The confidence present at the beginning of the evening had faded, not because anyone declared her wrong, because uncertainty had entered the room. And uncertainty kills investment momentum faster than almost anything. Finally, Richard spoke. "We'll need additional due diligence." The sentence sounded harmless. In reality, it was devastating. Every experienced founder understood what it meant. More review, more investigation, more questions, delays, scrutiny, risk. Victoria nodded professionally, but the narrator noticed the tension beneath the response. She understood the significance. The meeting continued for another hour, yet the outcome had already changed. No commitments were made, no funding announcements occurred, no celebration followed. The evening ended with uncertainty, exactly the thing investors dislike most. Near midnight, Abigail called Damon. Her voice remained calm. "They postponed the decision." Damon sat quietly. "How bad?" "Bad enough." She paused, then added another detail. The ownership questions dominated the evening. The apartment remained silent after the call ended. Outside, Austin's skyline glowed against the night sky. Inside, Damon looked at the folders spread across the table. Months earlier, Victoria believed visibility created authority. She believed controlling the story created truth. Now investors were beginning to learn something different. Stories could be challenged. Records could not. The narrator observed Damon shutting down his laptop shortly before midnight. For the first time since being removed, he sensed movement. Not victory, not yet, but movement. Because somewhere inside Veyra Collective executives were likely scrambling. Lawyers were likely reviewing documents. Investors were likely asking follow-up questions. And if those questions continued, they would eventually reach places Victoria never expected. Places hidden behind logos, behind branding, behind carefully managed narratives. Places where ownership, contribution, and evidence mattered far more than image. And the next questions would be even harder to answer. The first visible crack appeared 4 days after the investor dinner. It arrived in the form of an email, short, professional, dangerous. The message came from one of Veyra Collective's largest service providers. The subject line read, "Ownership Verification Request." The narrator observed that most growing companies depend on dozens of invisible relationships. Customers see products, investors see presentations, employees see offices. Very few people see the systems beneath everything. Payment processors, technology vendors, logistics partners, inventory providers, software integrations, the infrastructure holding the business together. And once questions about ownership begin spreading through that infrastructure, the consequences move quickly. The email requested clarification regarding authority over several operational assets. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet Damon immediately understood its significance. Questions had escaped the investor room. Now they were moving through the company's ecosystem, and ecosystems react. By the end of the week, additional requests appeared. Another vendor, then another, then another, each asking different questions, each seeking documentation, each requesting confirmation. The pattern was obvious. Nobody wanted to become entangled in a future ownership dispute. Across Austin, executives inside Veyra Collective faced an uncomfortable reality. The story they had carefully crafted was no longer enough. People wanted proof. The narrator noticed something ironic. For years, Damon had built systems specifically to eliminate uncertainty. Now, uncertainty was consuming the very company he helped create. One afternoon, Abigail called with an update. The due diligence process has expanded. Damon sat at his dining table reviewing records. How much, eh? More than they expected. What are investors asking? Abigail glanced at her notes. Operational ownership. She turned a page. Intellectual property. Another page. Financial contributions. Another. System architecture. Damon nodded slowly. The exact subjects Victoria least wanted examined. Because every question forced investigators toward documentation. And documentation favored facts, not branding, not visibility. Facts. Meanwhile, Veyra attempted to move forward. Publicly, the company projected confidence. Announcements continued. Marketing campaigns launched. Expansion plans remained active. Behind closed doors, the situation looked different. Lawyers reviewed records. Executives attended emergency meetings. Consultants generated reports. Everyone searched for reassurance. The narrator observed a common mistake organizations make during crises. They assume replacing people automatically transfers knowledge. It doesn't. Knowledge and access are not the same thing. That lesson would soon become expensive. 2 weeks after Damon's removal, Veyra hired a new chief technology officer. His name was Ethan Brooks, 34 years old, talented, ambitious, well-respected, a strong hire by most standards. The company presented his arrival as a major step forward. LinkedIn announcements celebrated the decision. Industry blogs covered the hire. Employees welcomed him enthusiastically. Ethan arrived believing he was joining a successful growth stage company. Within days, he discovered something else, a puzzle. The narrator observed Ethan's experience through the consequences visible to Damon. Not through Ethan's thoughts, only through facts. Those facts accumulated rapidly. Several vendors contacted Damon indirectly. Former contractors reached out. Industry contacts shared observations. The same theme emerged repeatedly. Ethan struggled to understand portions of the system architecture, not because he lacked ability, because documentation was incomplete. Many critical systems had evolved over years. Operational decisions existed across hundreds of interconnected processes. Inventory forecasting connected to fulfillment logic. Fulfillment logic connected to customer segmentation. Customer segmentation connected to subscription forecasting. Everything connected. Damon knew those relationships because he built them. Replacing the builder did not automatically transfer understanding. One afternoon, Abigail forwarded a message from a former contractor still working with Veyra. The note described confusion surrounding inventory forecasting. Apparently, forecasts no longer aligned with supplier ordering schedules. Minor issue, for now. Then another report appeared. A fulfillment integration generated inconsistent inventory counts. Again, minor, for now. then another, shipment reconciliation delays, then another, subscription synchronization errors. Individually, each problem seemed manageable. Together, they revealed something larger. The system was beginning to drift, not collapse, drift. The narrator noticed Damon reacting differently than most people might expect. He never smiled, never celebrated, never mocked the situation, because he understood something important. These problems affected employees, customers, vendors, people who had done nothing wrong. The company was still real. The consequences were real. Watching it struggle brought no satisfaction. What mattered was accountability, not destruction. Meanwhile, investor scrutiny intensified. Richard Nolan's group hired outside analysts, technology consultants, financial auditors, operational reviewers. Every layer of Veyra received additional examination. Weeks earlier, Victoria controlled the narrative. Now specialists controlled the questions. That difference mattered enormously. One Tuesday morning, Abigail received a particularly interesting report. She immediately shared it with Damon. The analysis focused on operational dependencies. In simple terms, how much of the company relied on systems originally created by Damon? The answer surprised nobody familiar with the facts. A great deal. Inventory systems, order routing, supplier forecasting, customer preference automation, subscription scheduling, warehouse coordination. The deeper investigators looked, the more connections appeared. The narrator observed a growing contradiction. Publicly, Veyra continued minimizing Damon's role. Privately, experts kept discovering evidence of his involvement. Reality and narrative were moving further apart. Eventually, one would win. The next complication arrived from a different direction. A major supplier requested revised authorization documents. Another requested ownership clarification. Then a software provider paused certain administrative modifications pending review. Nothing catastrophic, not yet. But friction was increasing. Friction slows growth. Growth stage companies survive on momentum. Momentum was fading. Around this time, Abigail filed additional legal actions, carefully targeted, narrowly focused, designed to preserve records and prevent asset transfers while ownership questions remained unresolved. Again, no drama, no television-style courtroom moments, just procedure. The narrator noticed that procedure often frightens experienced executives more than public accusations. Public accusations can be dismissed. Procedure creates obligations, deadlines, responses, evidence, and evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Then came the largest challenge facing Veyra, a major corporate rollout. Months earlier, the company secured a contract with Horizon Mutual Benefits, one of the largest clients in company history. Thousands of employee wellness packages, national visibility, significant revenue, a showcase opportunity. Success would strengthen investor confidence. Failure would do the opposite. Preparation accelerated. Warehouses increased activity. Inventory orders expanded. Shipping schedules intensified. Everyone focused on execution. Unfortunately, execution depends on systems, and systems were already showing signs of strain. Several internal reports identified inconsistencies, forecast mismatches, inventory allocation issues, order routing concerns, none individually catastrophic, collectively worrying. The narrator observed that complex failures rarely appear suddenly. They announce themselves quietly first. Small warning signs, minor discrepancies, tiny delays. Most organizations ignore them because immediate consequences seem limited. Weeks later, those same issues become crises. As launch preparations intensified, additional warning signs emerged. Supplier communications became less predictable. Inventory visibility weakened. Reconciliation reports required manual correction. Teams worked longer hours. Pressure increased. Deadlines approached. Outside observers saw growth. Inside, the operation tension accumulated. One evening, Abigail called Damon. Her tone remained calm, but focused. "Something's happening." Damon looked up from his laptop. "What kind of something?" "The system pressure is increasing." He understood immediately. Not because anyone inside Veyra told him, because operational patterns are predictable. When foundations weaken, strain appears first, then mistakes, then consequences. Abigail continued. Investors know it too. Silence followed. The city lights outside Damon's apartment reflected against the window. The future felt closer than before, not because victory was approaching, because truth was approaching, and truth has momentum. Before ending the call, Abigail shared one final update. The Horizon rollout begins next week. Damon nodded. The contract represented everything Veyra wanted. Revenue, credibility, expansion, momentum. If the rollout succeeded, Victoria might stabilize the situation. If it failed, every existing question would become louder, much louder. After the call ended, Damon sat quietly for several minutes. The apartment remained silent. The evidence folders still occupied one side of the dining table. Months of preparation, months of documentation, months of patience. Outside, Austin continued moving forward. Inside, Veyra Collective pressure continued building. And somewhere beneath the polished branding, investor presentations, and public confidence, thousands of pending orders were moving toward a launch that would reveal whether the company truly understood the systems keeping it alive. The Horizon mutual benefits rollout began on a Monday. By Wednesday morning, everyone inside Veyra Collective knew something was wrong. The first complaints appeared quietly. A missing shipment, an incorrect package, a delayed delivery notification. Nothing unusual. Large launches always generated minor issues. The narrator observed that experienced operators rarely panic during the first few complaints. They watch patterns. Patterns reveal whether problems are isolated or systemic. By noon, the pattern had become visible. Customer service tickets increased dramatically. Corporate account managers began receiving calls. Warehouse supervisors requested urgent reviews. Inventory counts no longer matched outgoing shipments. The problems were multiplying. Fast. Across Austin, emergency meetings filled Veyra's calendar. Executives moved between conference rooms. Operations teams worked overtime. Analysts reviewed reports. The company remained in motion, but confidence was beginning to disappear. The narrator noticed something important. The failure wasn't caused by sabotage. Not even close. Damon Coleman never touched the systems after his removal, never interfered, never disrupted operations, never contacted employees, never altered a single line of code. The problems emerged naturally, from misunderstanding, from overconfidence, from removing someone without fully understanding what he had built. There is a difference, a very important difference. By Tuesday afternoon, Horizon Mutual Benefits requested an explanation. Their rollout involved thousands of employees across multiple states. Executives expected precision. Instead, they received confusion. Some employees received duplicate wellness kits. Others received nothing. Several shipments contained incorrect customization selections. Inventory reports suggested products existed in warehouses where they did not. The errors continued spreading, like cracks moving through a foundation. The narrator observed Damon learning about most of it indirectly. Former vendors, industry contacts, mutual acquaintances. News travels quickly inside business communities, especially when a fast-growing company suddenly begins struggling. One former logistics partner called him late Tuesday evening. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it revealed enough. The warehouse is a mess. Damon remained silent. The caller continued. They're manually correcting reports. That detail mattered. Manual correction usually meant automated systems no longer aligned properly, a dangerous sign, especially during a large-scale rollout. After ending the call, Damon sat quietly at his dining table. The apartment felt familiar now. Evidence folders, legal documents, coffee cups. Weeks earlier, he would have been inside the office solving problems. Now he sat outside watching consequences unfold. The narrator noticed no satisfaction in him, only disappointment. Because despite everything, those systems represented years of work. Watching them fail felt strangely personal. Not because he wanted the company back, because he remembered building them. Meanwhile, Veyra's difficulties continued growing. By Wednesday morning, Horizon Mutual's procurement director requested a formal review meeting. Her name was Karen Mitchell, experienced, methodical, known for holding vendors accountable. Not the type of client companies wanted upset. Karen's concerns were direct: delivery accuracy, inventory consistency, order fulfillment reliability, contract compliance, basic operational expectations, the very areas where Veyra now appeared vulnerable. The narrator observed something ironic. For years, Victoria focused heavily on visibility, branding, marketing, storytelling. Those things mattered. But customers rarely stay because of stories. They stay because products arrive correctly. Operations determine survival, and operations were now under pressure. That same afternoon, Abigail received another update from Richard Nolan's investment group. The timing couldn't have been worse for Veyra. Investors already questioned ownership. Now they questioned execution. The combination proved dangerous. Ownership uncertainty creates hesitation. Operational instability creates fear. Together, they create risk, and investors avoid risk whenever possible. Abigail immediately informed Damon. Horizon is escalating concerns. Damon nodded. He wasn't surprised. What about the investors? They know. Silence followed. Both understood what that meant. Every new operational problem increased scrutiny. Every new question encouraged additional investigation. Every new investigation uncovered more history. History favored Damon, not because anyone manipulated it, because history happened. The records existed. The facts existed. No amount of branding could erase them. By Thursday morning, Veyra's internal pressure reached another level. Several employees reportedly worked overnight. Operations managers manually reviewed inventory allocations. Customer service representatives handled escalating complaints. The new CTO, Ethan Brooks, faced increasing demands. Everyone wanted answers. Unfortunately, answers require understanding. Understanding takes time. Time had become scarce. The narrator observed a truth many executives learned too late. Replacing a person is easy. Replacing accumulated knowledge is difficult. Replacing years of accumulated knowledge during a crisis is nearly impossible. The situation worsened Friday afternoon. A shipment reconciliation report revealed additional discrepancies. Inventory counts appeared inconsistent across multiple locations. Some products showed available inventory despite physical shortages. Others showed shortages despite physical availability. The data no longer reflected reality accurately. Operational teams scrambled to compensate. Manual reviews increased. Workloads expanded. Mistakes multiplied. The cycle fed itself. Late Friday, another call arrived, this time from a former contractor who still had friends inside Veyra. They're blaming software. Damon stared out the window. What software? Depends who you ask. The narrator noticed Damon almost smiling. Not from amusement, from recognition. Organizations often blame technology when they fail to understand processes. Yet software rarely creates problems by itself. People create problems. Systems merely reveal them. After ending the call, Damon reviewed several older documents, original process maps, implementation notes, architecture plans, the same materials he created years earlier. Many contained explanations, dependencies, warnings, relationships between systems. The documentation existed. The challenge was understanding it. That understanding took years to develop. The weekend brought little relief. Customer complaints continued. Horizon Mutual demanded corrective action plans. Investors requested updates. Lawyers exchanged communications. Every issue increased pressure on leadership. The narrator observed Victoria's position becoming increasingly difficult. Not because she lacked intelligence, not because she lacked ambition, because she had built her strategy around control. Control of messaging, control of narrative, control of visibility. Now events were escaping control. Operational failures do that. Facts do that. Neither asks permission. Monday morning introduced another development. Abigail filed additional motions connected to the ownership dispute. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just another step in the process. The court responded by scheduling preliminary hearing dates. Finally, the dispute was moving into an official forum. Not social media, not investor meetings, not public opinion. Court. The place where documentation matters. The place where records matter. The place where narratives must compete with evidence. The narrator noticed Damon feeling something unexpected when Abigail shared the hearing date. Relief, not excitement. Relief, because the endless uncertainty was beginning to narrow. Questions would eventually receive answers. Claims would require proof. History would be examined. Facts would matter. Later that afternoon, another update arrived from inside Veyra, a particularly difficult one. Horizon Mutual was considering contractual remedies if performance issues continued. The wording sounded professional, yet the meaning was unmistakable. The client was losing patience. Large clients rarely make threats immediately. They document concerns first, then they protect themselves. The pattern looked familiar, very familiar, because it resembled exactly what Abigail had done. Document, preserve, verify, act. The cycle repeated everywhere. Toward evening, Damon walked through a small neighborhood park near his apartment. The first time he had taken a real break in days. Children played nearby. Dogs chased tennis balls. The city seemed peaceful, normal. For a few minutes, he simply walked. The narrator observed his thoughts remaining focused not on revenge, but on consequences. Every event now unfolding had roots. Those roots stretched backward, past the rebranding, past the title changes, past the investor presentations, all the way back to one decision. The decision to remove someone while claiming ownership of what they built. Consequences often arrive slowly. Then, all at once. As sunset settled across Austin, Damon returned home. Another message waited from Abigail. Short, direct. The preliminary hearing date had been confirmed. 2 weeks away. Damon read it once, then again. The legal process was accelerating. Ownership questions remained unresolved. Investors remained uncertain. Clients remained concerned. Operational problems remained active. And now, for the first time, a judge would begin examining the facts. The narrator noticed Damon placing the phone beside his laptop. For weeks, pressure had been building inside Veyra Collective. Soon, that pressure would enter a courtroom. And unlike investors, consultants or clients' judges cared very little about branding. They cared about evidence. Fortunately, evidence was the one thing Damon Coleman had in abundance. The Travis County Courthouse was never designed to feel dramatic. No glass towers, no polished branding, just beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and the slow rhythm of people waiting for decisions that would change their lives. Damon Coleman arrived at 8:42 a.m. No entourage, no prepared speech, just a dark jacket, a folder of documents, and Abigail Foster walking slightly ahead of him. The narrator observed that Damon didn't look like someone entering a battle. He looked like someone entering a record-keeping process. Inside Courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was already tense. Victoria Hayes sat on the opposite side with her legal team. Her posture was controlled carefully, composed. Brooks Sterling was beside her, flipping through printed materials. Ethan Brooks was present too, though he looked less certain than the others. This was no longer a startup meeting. This was documentation versus narrative, truth versus presentation. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered at 9:03 a.m. No theatrics, no delay. The hearing began immediately. Abigail stood first. Her voice was calm, structured, and precise. Your Honor, this case concerns the ownership and operational control of a company known as Veyra Collective, formerly Brightnest Wellness. She paused only briefly, then placed the first document on record. A dated email from 2 years earlier. Subject line, System Architecture Plan. Brightnest Launch. Author Damon Coleman. The courtroom remained silent. Abigail continued. Over the next 30 minutes, she built a timeline. Not emotional, not interpretive. Just sequence. Invoices. Vendor agreements. Bank transfers. Early operational documents. Version histories from software repositories. Each item connected to Damon. Each one anchored in time. The narrator noticed Victoria's expression tightening slightly, though she remained composed. That was important. Composure often hides calculation. Abigail moved to the next section. Your Honor. These are original system logs showing creation of core operational infrastructure. She projected a screen, lines of code, timestamps, user identifiers, every entry attributed to Damon Coleman. The judge leaned forward slightly, not impressed, not skeptical, simply attentive. Then came the critical shift. Abigail displayed a financial summary. Thousands of dollars in early operational expenses, paid directly from Damon's personal account, before company funding, before investor involvement, before formal structure. Victoria's attorney stood. Objection. Context is being misrepresented. Judge Whitaker raised a hand. Overruled. Continue. The narrator observed Damon's expression. No change, because none of this was new to him. He already knew what existed. What mattered was not discovery. It was confirmation. Abigail continued. Every major operational system in this company can be traced to Mr. Coleman's documented contributions. She paused, then added one sentence that changed the room's tone. This includes systems still currently in use by Veyra Collective today. A quiet shift passed through the courtroom. Not dramatic, but noticeable. Victoria finally leaned toward her attorney and whispered something. The narrator could not hear it, but the timing mattered, because it was the first visible sign of uncertainty. Victoria's lawyer responded quickly. Your Honor, Mr. Coleman's role was advisory. Execution and ownership belonged to the company and its founder. Abigail did not react emotionally. She simply opened another folder. Let's address that. She placed a printed document on the record, the original investor pitch deck, version dated 18 months earlier, before rebranding, before title changes, before the removal. She highlighted one section. Founding Team. At that moment, Damon's original title appeared clearly. Co-founder and head of operations architecture. Not advisor, not contractor, not support. Co-founder. Abigail turned slightly toward the opposing counsel. This is the original investor document distributed during early funding discussions. Then she added quietly, before revisions. The word revisions carried weight, because revisions imply change. Change implies intent. The courtroom remained still. Judge Whitaker reviewed the document carefully, then spoke. Are there multiple versions of this deck? Abigail nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We have every version. She placed them in chronological order. The narrator observed Victoria's breathing change slightly. Not panic, but awareness. Awareness that sequence matters. Abigail continued. In subsequent versions, Mr. Coleman's role was systematically reduced. She displayed a timeline. Co-founder, operations partner, technical advisor, senior technical advisor. Each change dated, each change documented, each change traceable. The judge studied the progression, then asked the key question. Who authorized these changes? Silence followed. Victoria's attorney responded carefully. These were internal branding decisions. Abigail immediately replied. Internal branding decisions do not alter operational reality. That sentence shifted the room again, because it separated perception from function. The judge looked toward Victoria. Ms. Hayes, did Mr. Coleman contribute to system development? Victoria hesitated. Just long enough. Yes, he assisted in early development phases. Abigail opened another file. Then let's clarify assisted. She displayed Git repository logs, creation timestamps, commit histories, system architecture files, all authored by Damon Coleman. Not assisted, not partially involved. Authored. The narrator noticed Ethan Brooks shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Because technical professionals understand what those logs mean. They are not subjective. They are proof of origin. Abigail continued. There is no evidence of Mr. Coleman being an auxiliary contributor. She paused. Only primary authorship. The courtroom felt heavier now. Victoria's lawyer attempted to redirect. Even if contributions exist, they do not imply ownership rights. Abigail nodded once. That is correct. Then she added the line that changed everything. They imply equity dispute, not dismissal. The judge leaned back slightly. Now the case had clarity. Ownership dispute, not employment disagreement, Not advisory misunderstanding. Ownership. A different category entirely. The narrator observed Damon finally shifting in his seat for the first time. Not discomfort. Resolution. Because the case was now correctly defined. Abigail concluded her presentation with one final sequence. Email chains from early formation. Messages where Victoria acknowledged Damon's foundational role. One message in particular appeared on screen. Victoria Hayes 2 years earlier. You built the system. I handle the front-facing side. The courtroom remained silent after it appeared. No one spoke immediately, because that message contradicted the current narrative more clearly than anything else. Victoria looked away briefly, just for a moment, but the narrator noticed it. Judge Whitaker finally spoke. This court will review all submitted documentation. She paused, then added, and will require clarification on ownership structure prior to any interim ruling. The meaning was clear. Nothing was decided yet, but everything had shifted. The hearing adjourned at 12:41 p.m. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, heavier, slower. Victoria exited with her legal team without speaking. Brooke followed silently. Ethan Brooks lingered briefly, then left in the opposite direction. Damon remained standing in the hallway. Abigail joined him. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Damon asked one question. Where does this go next? Abigail closed her folder. Discovery intensifies. A pause. Everything they've avoided will now be examined. The narrator observed Damon looking toward the courthouse doors. Inside, everything had changed. Outside, nothing looked different. That was often how turning points worked. Invisible at first, then unavoidable. As they walked toward the exit, Abigail added one final line. Victoria's story just stopped being enough. Damon didn't respond. He didn't need to, because for the first time since the night his access was revoked, the direction of the situation was no longer controlled by the person who had removed him. It was controlled by the record, and records, unlike people, do not forget. The email arrived at 7:06 a.m. Victoria Hayes didn't open it immediately. She stared at the subject line for several seconds. Legal preservation notice. Veyra Collective. Brightnest Wellness. Historical records. The room around her felt unusually still. Brooke Sterling stood near the window of Victoria's downtown Austin office, scrolling through her phone without speaking. Ethan Brooks was already inside reviewing system reports that no longer made sense in the way they used to. Nothing had technically collapsed yet, but something had definitely shifted. Victoria finally clicked the email. The attachment loaded slowly. Pages of legal language, request for preservation, formal notification of litigation escalation, and then the supporting packet. That was where everything changed. The narrator observed Victoria's expression tighten for the first time since the entire situation began. Not fear, not panic, recognition, because she understood exactly what she was looking at. This wasn't a warning. It was a structure, a carefully assembled structure. Timelines, documents, version histories, financial contributions, system architecture records, emails she had forgotten existed, messages she had assumed were irrelevant. They were all there, organized, connected, individually harmless, collectively devastating. Brooke leaned slightly forward. What is it? Victoria didn't answer immediately. She kept scrolling. The further she went, the quieter the room became. Finally, she said, "They've built a narrative." Her voice was controlled, but the narrator noticed something underneath it. A shift, because Victoria had spent years building narratives herself. She understood exactly what a well-constructed one looked like. This wasn't improvisation. This was preparation. Meanwhile, across Austin, Damon Coleman was sitting at his dining table. No celebration, no satisfaction, just quiet observation. Abigail Foster had called him earlier. "We've triggered formal discovery procedures." Damon simply replied, "Okay." Now he was reading system logs again. Not because he needed to, because he understood what came next. Discovery meant exposure. Exposure meant contradiction, and contradiction meant instability. At 9:32 a.m., Richard Nolan's investment group received the full legal packet. Within minutes, responses began circulating. Not publicly, privately, internal emails, analyst discussions, risk evaluations. The tone changed immediately. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now concern. Where there had been optimism, there was now caution. And where there had been trust, there was now verification. Victoria called an emergency meeting. Fast, urgent, controlled panic disguised as structure. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere felt different than before. No presentation screens, no branding slides, no confident storytelling, just people and problems. Ethan Brooks was the first to speak. The system dependencies are deeper than expected. Brooke followed. The narrative issues are becoming the main focus externally. Victoria remained at the head of the table, silent for a moment. Then she said, "We respond with clarity." The narrator noticed something important. Clarity is often the last defense when control begins to slip. But clarity requires consistency. And consistency requires alignment between story and reality. Victoria's problem was simple. Those two things no longer matched. Across town, Damon received another update from Abigail. Investors are now reviewing internal contributions. Damon didn't reply immediately. He understood what that meant. The focus had moved from ownership claims to operational truth, from structure to origin, from branding to creation. And origin was the one area Victoria could not fully reshape, because origin was recorded. The next day brought escalation. A major vendor suspended account modifications pending legal clarification. A logistics partner requested emergency confirmation of system ownership. A software provider temporarily restricted administrative changes. Each decision created friction. Each friction slowed operations. Each slowdown increased pressure. The narrator observed a pattern repeating across systems. When uncertainty enters infrastructure, movement slows. When movement slows, revenue becomes fragile. When revenue becomes fragile, leadership becomes exposed. By midweek, Veyra Collective was no longer operating at full capacity. Not officially, not publicly, but functionally. Orders were still processed, but with delays. Reports were still generated, but inconsistently. Clients were still receiving products, but not at the expected standard. And Horizon Mutual Benefits was watching closely, very closely. Karen Mitchell sent a formal notice requesting performance review documentation. Her message was simple. Please provide explanation for fulfillment discrepancies observed during rollout phase. No emotion, just accountability. Inside Veyra, the meeting that followed was tense. Ethan suggested system audits. Brooke recommended communication control. Victoria pushed for narrative stabilization. But none of these addressed the core issue. Because the core issue wasn't perception. It was structure, and structure had already been exposed. That evening, Damon walked through downtown Austin. The city felt unchanged. Restaurants full, traffic moving, music from open patios, life continuing normally. But beneath that normality, a parallel system was shifting. Legal systems, financial systems, operational systems, the invisible frameworks that actually define corporate survival. Abigail met him near Republic Square. She didn't waste time. They're responding now. Damon looked at her, defensively, strategically. She handed him a summary report. Investor concerns had escalated. Additional due diligence had been triggered. Several parties were reconsidering exposure, and Horizon's internal review had entered escalation phase. Damon nodded slowly. Where does that leave us? Abigail paused. Discovery hearings expand next week. A beat. Everything becomes formalized. The narrator observed Damon processing this without visible emotion, not because he didn't care, but because emotional reaction no longer served any purpose. The system was now in motion, outside individual control. The next morning, Victoria received another development, a scheduled emergency board-level consultation, requested by investors, not her. That detail mattered, because it marked a shift in authority. She was no longer the sole narrator of the company's direction. Others were now shaping the conversation. Inside the meeting, investors were direct. They asked about Damon, about his contributions, about system ownership, about historical records, about financial involvement. Each question reduced narrative space. Each answer narrowed flexibility. Victoria attempted to maintain control, but control depends on accepted framing, and the framing had already been broken. Richard Nolan finally spoke. "We are not questioning leadership." He paused. "We are clarifying foundation." That distinction changed everything. Leadership is perception. Foundation is fact. And facts were now under examination. That evening, Victoria returned to her office alone. Brooke had already left. Ethan remained only briefly before heading home. The building felt larger than usual, or emptier. She opened her laptop, reviewed internal systems, then legal documents, then investor notes. Everything pointed in the same direction. Not collapse, not victory, exposure. The narrator observed Victoria sitting still for a long time, not because she lacked options, but because every option required acknowledging something she had avoided for years, that Damon Coleman was not peripheral. He was structural, and structural components cannot be removed without consequences. At 11:48 p.m., she finally closed her laptop. Outside, Austin was quiet. Inside Veyra Collective, nothing had officially ended, but everything had changed. Across the city, Damon received one final message from Abigail that night. "They are preparing for settlement discussions." He read it once, then set his phone down. The narrator noticed something subtle in him now. Not satisfaction, not anger, not revenge, just inevitability. Because the case had moved beyond interpretation. It had entered consequence, and consequence, once activated, does not require permission to continue. The settlement talks did not begin with a meeting. They began with silence. Silence from investors, silence from vendors, silence from partners who had once responded within minutes and now took hours. Inside Veyra Collective, that silence felt heavier than any formal accusation. Victoria Hayes sat in her office reading the same 3 lines of an email over and over again. "We are open to structured resolution discussions. No hostility, no threat, just distance." The narrator observed that distance in business often signals something more dangerous than conflict. It signals repositioning. Richard Nolan's group was repositioning. So were other investors. So were key vendors. Everyone was adjusting exposure. Everyone was recalculating risk. Across Austin, Damon Coleman was not part of those conversations. Not directly. He didn't attend negotiation calls. He didn't make public statements. He didn't engage in media narratives. He simply worked with Abigail Foster through structured legal channels. Facts, documentation, validation. That was all. On a Tuesday morning, Abigail called. "They've agreed to preliminary settlement discussions." Damon didn't react immediately. He was reviewing system logs from the early Brightnest architecture again. Not because he needed confirmation, because understanding patterns required repetition. "Condition?" he asked. Abigail paused briefly. "Recognition of contribution is on the table." Damon closed his laptop slightly. "And ownership, that's the negotiation." The narrator observed something subtle in Damon's expression. Not satisfaction, not relief, a kind of measured acceptance, because this was the stage where reality finally had to be named. For months, Victoria had controlled the public story, but settlement discussions were not public. They were structured, document-driven, evidence-heavy, and deeply uncomfortable for narratives built on perception. Later that day, Victoria received the official settlement framework proposal. She read it alone. Brooke Sterling had advised her to take time before reacting. Ethan Brooks suggested focusing on technical stabilization instead. But Victoria read it immediately, line by line. The proposal outlined 3 core areas: operational contribution recognition, equity restructuring consideration, historical attribution review. The language was neutral, almost clinical, but the implications were anything but. Because for the first time, the company was being asked to formally acknowledge Damon Coleman's foundational role. Not informally, not symbolically, legally. The narrator noticed Victoria's reaction wasn't explosive. It was controlled. That control had always been her strength. But control becomes difficult when the problem is structural rather than rhetorical. She closed the document. then reopened it, then closed it again. Finally, she stood up and walked to the window. Downtown Austin stretched outward beneath gray light. The city looked unchanged, but her position inside it had shifted. Across town, Damon received a call from Abigail. They want to propose revised equity terms. Damon asked, "What does that mean?" In practical terms, Abigail didn't sugarcoat it. They are acknowledging you as foundational contributor. A pause, which affects ownership structure. Damon nodded slowly, not because he was pleased, because it was expected. Truth, when finally forced into formal systems, always adjusts ownership. The narrator observed that Damon wasn't celebrating. He was processing, because acknowledgement was not the goal. Resolution was, and resolution required structure, not emotion. Meanwhile, Veyra Collective began internal restructuring discussions, not publicly announced, not externally visible, but deeply active. Lawyers met daily, executives adjusted messaging, consultants refined language. The goal was simple: minimize disruption, preserve company viability, avoid collapse. But underlying all of it was one unavoidable truth: the system they built depended on someone who was no longer inside it. Ethan Brooks discovered this firsthand during a technical audit session. He spent 2 days mapping system dependencies. By the 3rd day, he stopped calling it architecture. He started calling it interdependency web. Everything connected. Inventory forecasting linked to subscription logic linked to fulfillment routing linked to vendor contracts linked to early system design decisions. Every path led back to the same origin point: Damon Coleman. Ethan reported his findings internally. The response was immediate silence, not disagreement, not denial, silence, because no one had a simple way to replace origin. At the same time, Horizon Mutual Benefits submitted a formal review update. The report was blunt: operational instability observed, fulfillment inconsistencies unresolved, system reliability below expected threshold. The implication was clear: continued partnership at risk. That message carried weight far beyond Veyra, because Horizon was not just a client, it was validation. Loss of validation meant loss of credibility. Loss of credibility meant financial consequences. Inside, Veyra meetings became more urgent. The tone shifted from growth to survival. Victoria now faced a reality she had never prepared for. Leading a company is very different from maintaining one someone else designed. The narrator observed that she began to speak less about vision and more about recovery. But recovery requires understanding what is broken, and understanding requires acknowledging structure. That acknowledgement was still incomplete. By the end of the week, settlement discussions intensified. Abigail presented revised documentation packages, each one more precise than the last, each one more difficult to dispute. Financial contributions, system development timelines, email confirmations of co-founding roles, version-controlled architecture records, vendor testimony summaries, investor correspondence. Every layer reinforced the same conclusion: Damon Coleman had not assisted, he had built. Late Friday evening, Damon and Abigail reviewed the latest proposal together. The call was quiet. Abigail spoke first. "They're offering a structured equity adjustment." Damon listened. "What does that look like?" Abigail scanned the document. Recognition of co-founder status. A pause. Retroactive equity allocation. Another pause. Operational ownership acknowledgement. Damon leaned back slightly. "And control of systems. That depends on final agreement terms." The narrator observed something important here. This was no longer about proving involvement. That phase was complete. This was about restructuring consequences. What happens when a company realizes its foundation was misattributed? After the call ended, Damon sat alone for a long time, not thinking about victory, not thinking about loss, thinking about correction. Because correction is what happens when systems realign with truth. Meanwhile, Victoria faced her own internal reality, not in public, not in meetings, but alone. For the first time since founding Brightnest, She was not shaping the narrative. She was reacting to it. Every external communication now referenced documents she could not ignore. Every investor question pointed toward evidence she could not fully reframe. Every legal update reduced flexibility. The narrator observed that she began to understand something uncomfortable. The company had not been built solely through vision. It had been built through work she could not personally replicate. That realization did not come as a single moment. It arrived gradually, through meetings, through reports, through unanswered questions, through systems she did not fully understand, but still depended on. One evening, Brooke Sterling visited her office. She spoke carefully. "They're not negotiating perception anymore." Victoria didn't respond immediately. Brooke continued, "They're negotiating structure." That word landed differently. Structure, not story, not branding. Structure, because structure is harder to influence, harder to rewrite, harder to control. Across Austin, Damon reviewed updated system documentation that Abigail's team had compiled. Everything now aligned: timeline, ownership, contribution, access history, financial input. The narrative was no longer fragmented. It was consolidated. The legal hearing had forced alignment between truth and record, and that alignment created pressure elsewhere. At 11:12 p.m., Abigail sent one final message. "They are preparing a formal settlement framework response." Damon read it once, then placed his phone down. Outside, the city remained unchanged. Inside, Veyra Collective change was now unavoidable, because once structure is exposed, it cannot be unseen. And once truth enters formal systems, it does not leave quietly. The final settlement meeting was not held in a courtroom. It was not held in a boardroom either. It took place in a neutral legal conference space in downtown Austin, the kind designed to erase emotion from decisions that already carried too much of it. Glass walls, neutral lighting, no branding, no corporate identity. Just documents on a long table and people trying to decide how history should be written moving forward. Damon Coleman arrived first, not early, not late, exactly on time. Abigail Foster was already inside organizing folders with quiet precision. Across the table, Victoria Hayes sat with her legal team. Brooke Sterling was there again, but quieter than before. Ethan Brooks had been included as a technical observer. The narrator observed something unusual immediately. No one spoke for almost a full minute after everyone was seated. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said in documents. This meeting was not about discovery. It was about closure. Richard Nolan's representatives joined remotely through a secure screen connection. Their presence alone signaled importance. Investors did not attend settlement discussions unless the outcome mattered financially. Abigail began. Calm voice, structured language. "We are here to finalize recognition of contribution and resolve ownership attribution regarding Veyra Collective and its predecessor, Brightnest Wellness." She placed the final compiled document set on the table. One thick folder, chronological order, fully verified, no speculation, no interpretation, just records. Victoria's attorney responded first. "We are willing to acknowledge Mr. Coleman's early technical contributions." Abigail didn't react. She simply opened the folder. "That is not the question." The room tightened slightly, because that sentence changed direction. She continued, "The question is whether contributions were supportive or foundational." A pause. "Those are not the same category." The narrator observed Damon sitting still. No visible tension, no visible anticipation, just attention. Victoria finally spoke. Her voice was controlled but lower than usual. "We built this company together." Abigail turned a page. "You did." Then she looked up, but not in equal capacity. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence, structured silence, the kind that forms when truth is being measured rather than debated. Abigail projected a timeline onto the screen. It filled the wall, a full operational history, from idea stage to system architecture, to first vendor integration, to first customer order, to full-scale rollout, every milestone tagged with documented authorship. every technical system attributed, every financial contribution recorded. The narrator noticed Ethan Brooks leaning slightly forward, because for the first time he was seeing the company not as it functioned now, but as it was constructed. Abigail spoke again. Every core system still in operation today originates from Mr. Coleman's design work. She clicked once. A list appeared. Fulfillment architecture, subscription system, inventory forecasting engine, vendor integration network, customer behavior model, operational automation layer. She paused. These systems were not replaced after his removal. Another pause. They were inherited. That word mattered. Inherited implies dependency. Dependency implies ownership relevance. Victoria's attorney attempted to respond. We acknowledge technical involvement, but ownership belongs to the registered entity. Abigail nodded. That is why we are here. She placed another document on the table. Legal clarification of registered entity versus foundational contribution. The narrator observed something subtle in Victoria's posture. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the conversation. She was reacting to it. Abigail continued. There are 3 possible resolutions. She counted them calmly. 1. Maintain current structure and proceed with litigation. A pause. 2. Recognition without equity adjustment. Another pause. 3. Structured equity realignment with co-founder attribution. The room went quiet again, because each option carried consequences. Litigation meant exposure. Recognition without equity meant instability. Realignment meant redistribution. Richard Nolan's representative spoke through the screen. What is the recommended path based on documentation? Abigail didn't hesitate. Realignment reflects operational reality. The narrator observed Damon for the first time in the meeting, leaned slightly forward. Not emotionally, practically. Because this was the moment where recorded truth and legal structure began aligning. Victoria finally spoke again. If we proceed with realignment, what happens operationally? Abigail answered carefully. Damon Coleman's role becomes formally recognized as co-founder and systems architect. A pause. Equity and governance structure are adjusted accordingly. Silence followed. Longer this time. Not dramatic, just final. Victoria looked down at the table. The narrator noticed something important in that moment. Not defeat, understanding. Because she was now seeing the gap between narrative and infrastructure clearly, for the first time. The story she had presented to the world did not fully match the system that existed beneath it. And systems do not care about storytelling. Abigail placed the final document forward. This is the proposed settlement structure. Damon finally spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. What does this mean for the company going forward? Abigail turned slightly toward him. It stabilizes ownership. A pause, and restores accurate attribution. The narrator observed Damon absorbing this, not as victory, but as correction. Because correction was always his mindset. Fix what is misaligned, restore what is inaccurate, move forward. Victoria's attorney reviewed the document carefully, then spoke. This will require board approval. Richard Nolan's representative responded immediately. The board will likely follow documented evidence. That sentence shifted everything again, because investors rarely overrule evidence when risk is involved. Victoria understood that. So did everyone else in the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now. If I agree, what happens to the company's current operations? Abigail answered directly. They continue. A pause, with corrected ownership structure. The narrator noticed something almost invisible in Victoria's expression. Relief, not full, but partial, because one fear remained. Collapse, and collapse was no longer the outcome on the table. Damon finally looked across at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just observation, because this was no longer about conflict. It was about resolution of structure. After several minutes, Victoria nodded once, then we proceed. The sentence was small, but final. The room didn't react immediately, because everyone understood what it meant. Not victory, not defeat. Closure. Abigail closed her folder. That concludes the primary settlement framework. Silence followed again, but different silence this time. Lighter. Not because tension disappeared, but because uncertainty ended. Outside the conference room, Austin continued moving as it always did. Traffic, noise, life. Inside, something had been formally corrected, not emotionally, structurally. The narrator observed Damon remain seated for a few seconds after the meeting ended. No celebration, no speech, no reaction. Then he stood, gathered his folder, and walked toward the exit. Abigail followed beside him. Behind them, the legal teams began organizing final documents. Victoria remained seated for a moment longer. Brooke touched her shoulder briefly before leaving. Ethan Brooks left without speaking. Outside the building, daylight hit the street in a way that felt almost ordinary. Damon stopped briefly on the sidewalk. Abigail turned toward him. "It's done." He nodded, not with satisfaction, with acknowledgement. Because for Damon Coleman, the outcome had never been about winning something back. It had been about restoring alignment between truth and record. And now, for the first time since the night his access was revoked, those two things matched. The narrator observed him looking down the street. People walking, cars passing, the city continuing without awareness of what had just changed inside one small, legal room. Then Damon spoke quietly. "What happens next?" Abigail replied simply. "Now you build again." A pause, but this time under your name. Damon didn't respond immediately. He just nodded once, not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been recorded correctly. And as he walked forward down the sidewalk, there was no sense of triumph behind him, only continuity. Because some endings are not victories, they are corrections, and corrections once completed allow life to move forward without distortion.